Good day, class. Today we'll be discussing Chapter 22 on climate change. The first article we'll look at is on page 506. It's by the National Center for Science Education, called How Will Climate Change Affect the World and Society? The overall goal of this article is to try and show the wide range of ways climate change will impact the ecosystems across the planet. And it's not just one universal impact from climate change, but rather varies from region to region and environment to environment. The authors support this with the first column, page 506, where they explain that oceans rising will cause increased storm systems along shorelines and coastal areas. That was one major area of rising sea levels. The second main point they bring up is how oxygen-producing plankton, tiny organisms that live in the ocean, consumed by whales, are increasingly being impacted by the rising acidity of oceans. As oceans get hotter, more acidic, which then affects how well these plankton can survive. This matters because plankton produce oxygen, so it can impact the oxygen supply in environment, which can have larger impacts on other animals as well. On page 507, paragraph 7, they also bring up data from the CDC showing how the authors use logical appeals and outside sources to support their argument, highlighting that change migrations, animal species dying out, becoming overpopulated, changing the balance of the ecosystem, and as animals move from place to place to try and survive, will also increase the likelihood of spreading diseases these animals can carry. This would also eventually translate into people as well. So it highlights not only does it impact weather, but also animals as well, which will then contribute to increasing the spread or possible rise of different types of diseases. Paragraph 10 goes on to point out that many researchers are working to reduce greenhouse gases, and that's the key to reducing these problems. So it shows that while the essay argues overall there's a range of reactions to climate change, the solution they still highlight and emphasize is reducing greenhouse gases. By doing this, it reduces the increase in temperatures, which impacts the oceans and other parts of the environment. So it shows that's one singular key to help reduce all these problems is through reduction of greenhouse gases overall. All right, so that ends that first article. The second one we'll look at is on page 509. This one's by Marlene Simmons, called Americans' Mental Health is Latest Victim of Climate Change. This article is unique because it looks at the psychological impact climate change has on people. Oftentimes, this argument deals with environmental impacts, animal impacts, or just on humans in terms of natural disasters. This article looks more at the internalized impacts that climate change has on people. So it definitely gives a unique approach to this controversial topic or well-argued topic. First thing she goes into is paragraph 3, where she argues the impact of climate change is larger than we realize. So she highlights this idea that the impact on people's mental health is one area that has been addressed and also raises the stakes on why this topic matters so much. She goes in to support this further in the second column, page 509, where she argues the increasing fears for the future and disasters that are oncoming will affect people's current behavior. She says in the middle of the page, says that the physical toll has been studied, but the psychological impacts of climate change have not been addressed, said Lisa Van Sutren, forensic psychiatrist and one of the report's authors. We must not forget that people who are physically affected by climate change will also be suffering from the emotional fallout of what has happened to them. Others suffer emotionally from a distance, especially those who are most keenly aware perils we face, or as in the case of children, those who feel especially vulnerable. And psychological damage is not only over what is happening now, but what is likely going to happen in the future. So it shows how this ties to the idea of anxiety and fears both of oncoming disasters, dealing with current ones, as well as the long-term impact, especially on children growing up in a world where this fear, these large dangers, are coming in their lifetimes. And it goes on page 510. She goes into in paragraph 20 and 21, shows the toll of storms in recent years on people's health when she goes in paragraph 20 describing the issues of Hurricane Sandy's impact on people living in the East Coast. She explains that yes, as bad as it was for Innsmouth, it was far worse for others. Nearly 300 people died, and many lost their homes permanently. This knowledge weighed heavily on Innsmouth, who felt guilty about her own emotional reactions. I thought I had no right to feel what I was feeling because my situation wasn't as bad as theirs, she says. She found solace at a local Hurricane Sandy support group, or shortly after the disaster. Innsmouth's emotions were all normal reactions to a life-shattering situation, says Dr. Lori Nadal, the psychotherapist who started the group and who lost her own Long Beach home to the storm. I knew there was a need for a safe place for people to come and talk about what they were going through. It can be very isolating. You need a place where you can share and normalize your experiences with other people. And she goes on to add that um, psychologists showed that better efforts to push government to support other people will help them deal with kind of these reactions. It says that without such action, the impact of heat waves, extreme storms and floods, droughts and water shortages, food production problems, lessened air quality, sea level rise, and displacement from homes and communities is likely to pose significant mental health challenges to millions of Americans and billions of others worldwide, psychologists wrote in their letter. Resulting stress and rise in mental illness likely will harm interpersonal relationships, make people less able to work constructively or do well in school, and ultimately injure the day-to-day functioning of our society and our economy, Group told Congress. Hurricane Katrina demonstrates all these outcomes in microcosm to the American people. And ample body of research strongly predicts severe psychological and social consequences. So it shows how, including this testimony from this Congress panel that doctors gave about the impacts of mental health from natural disasters, highlights how, as weather patterns change, as disasters increase due to climate change, so too the reactions in total will have on people that survive them, and also how it affects the larger economy and social structure. It's important because it shows how the author is connecting all these ideas together. It's not just how one person's mental health is impacted, but how it then echoes through the society around them in terms of their job, their education, their ability to take care of the people, take care of themselves. All these things are impacted by their mental health stressors, which is then impacted by these storms. So it shows how she develops cause and effect relationship, and she builds on a piece at a time as she layers out her argument throughout the text. Then she ends with the last column where she argues that part of dealing with this is learning how to cope with an unpredictable world. That helping people try and cope with anxiety is having to deal with a certain degree of uncertainty and things that are beyond their control. So I think she ends this way, not necessarily to say just to give up, but rather how to deal with the unknown is just basically one way to deal with this. And as a way to kind of cope, and also ties into how to deal with this in terms of support groups, which she mentions earlier from the other quotes, is a main area of helping people get help. That they don't have to go through this alone, they can seek out help, and that'll make all the difference in how they deal with these events when they occur or their fears for the future. So it ties into larger ethical ideas in our argument of collective strength, teamwork, and community building to counter the kind of larger problems that communities are hit when these disasters happen and fear them happening in the future. All right, the third essay on page 511, Healthcare Confronts Climate Change. Schools, Providers Focus on Health Effects to Dampen Political Opposition, by Andes Rozenex. Argues on page 512, paragraph 5 brings up, says Parker, author of an '08 book on climate change and health that is used as a textbook called Climate Change, a Risk Amplifier. There isn't a disease that directly results from climate change. It just makes them more likely. And goes on further part of the page, says, climate change is a hot button issue, so as a nurse educator, I focus on empirical facts, she added. We're seeing longer allergy seasons, and because of that, we're seeing increased respiratory disorders. So it shows that different medical professionals, Rozenek cites, adds to how healthcare professionals see an impact on people's personal health. In terms of allergies, for example, increasing worsening conditions in the air affects people's respiratory illnesses like allergies and other illnesses as well. And also the earlier quote references how diseases are more likely. This corroborates what the earlier article said about CDC's quote on the effects on disease from climate change. And it goes on paragraph 10. The quote it provides says, climate change is presumed to affect health in many more ways directly as thermal stress, extreme weather disasters, and infectious diseases, she said. We are preparing for our students to be leaders in the global context. It shows that they talk about how people being trained in the medical field are being prepared to deal with these situations, trying to help them aid patients that are dealing with the impacts of climate change on their medical, personal health on a regular basis. And it goes on further in the page, paragraph 13 on, references quotes from Angela Wan, a graduate student at UM School of Public Health, who's currently an intern in California. Public health and healthcare leaders need to talk a lot more about effects of climate change. It's affecting health of their patients. It just isn't just about polar bears, she says. So it shows how Rozenex is kind of addressing the counter argument that a lot of issues about climate change in the past focus just more on the polar ice caps melting, impacts on animals living in those regions, that Juan's point is important because it shows how this affects people here, locally, where people live across the world, not just in Arctic areas. And it's kind of part of the larger point the article is making, is the communal interconnected impact this is having. It goes in paragraph 15, argues one program that helps people find ways to make low impact. So it argues that they also recommend passive cooling strategies and refer clients to resources with local utility PG&E partner program where they can get utility bill assistance to help boost the energy performance of their home. Goal is to avoid negative health impacts of extreme heat or reducing the home's carbon footprint. So it shows different examples or suggestions for people to do to make their homes more energy efficient, to reduce pollution, which reduces then rising pollution in the air, which affects climate change. So it shows how trying to draw connections between people's behavior in their daily lives, how they live, and the environment around them. And it goes on page 513, paragraph 23. It shows the possible healthcare companies can reduce carbon footprints, where it says that last October, however, Gunderson broke the sound barrier by producing more energy from its renewable sources than it consumed, Platt said. Energy comes from wind and solar, methane from the manure of 2,000 cows from a nearby dairy, geothermal heating and cooling sources drawn from the ground underneath the parking lot, and a biomass boiler creates energy from wood chips. With a system used to get natural gas from companies in Pennsylvania and Texas, it now gets wood from local sources. So this really kind of shows how, one example, how large healthcare facilities like hospitals are moving towards more renewable and greener energy sources to try and reduce their own carbon footprint. So this really highlights Rosenek's wide approach, not just on how healthcare services can directly care for patients better, but also ways they can advise them to change how they live to improve their health, and also how hospital facilities can function in a more environmentally positive way. So there's a wide range way how the healthcare industry ties to responding in various ways to the issue of the healthcare crisis. And it goes on to page 514. Paragraph 31 and 32 highlights how Kaiser Permanente, one of the major hospital companies, is going to increasingly try and transfer to more green energy sources and gives different stats on ways to do this in their goals. It shows a larger plan going forward. This is not just a one-time anomaly, but larger plans these systems administrators are putting in motion to gradually work towards these transitions to greener energy sources, and how they thought through this in a longer goal mindset than just the immediate reaction. All right, the fourth article, Jennifer Leddens, Should We Be Having Kids in the Age of Climate Change? Looks more at the kind of personal aspects of this. All right, this article by Ledden looks at some of the ethical aspects of dealing with climate change, similar to what we saw looking at the issues of medical responsibility by the medical profession dealing with climate change, as well as the issues of looking more at like how we deal with this and what's considered morally right or wrong in terms of responses. The first article is more a logical-based approach. That was just about how climate change impacts the environment. As you go on, we start to see dealing more with like the right or wrong ways to deal with this and why we should be emotionally, ethically invested and how people are affected by this. Now, the strategy matters for these articles because the more we can see how people are impacted by this in a meaningful way, the more can instill a need to respond or deal with the situation, not just ignore it or to for some people to keep contesting if it's even happening. And it's kind of like the overall goal, I think, of this article on having children in the age of climate change. Starts off, thesis goes into on paragraph, top of page 515, where it says that why question such assumptions, the prospect of climate catastrophe. This goes into the question of why would people have second thoughts about having children. In this case, the article directly points out because of issues of climate change that should move people to really think about how that will affect their choice to have children or not. And he goes into paragraph 14, argues that Americans and other rich nations produce the most carbon emissions per capita, he says, on the outside sources cites. This is from citing Ryder. Travis Ryder, who's at James Madison University, Southwest Virginia. So one of the professors there that the article references points out that people in the world's poorest nations are most likely to suffer severe climate impacts, and that seems to fair, he says. It's also a moral duty to future generations that will live amid climate devastation being created now. Here's a provocative thought. Maybe we should protect our kids by not having them, writer says. His argument sounds pretty persuasive in the classroom. At home, it was a different matter. So it shows that part of Lenin's approach to the essay is look at this from a very personal level. It takes writer, a philosophy professor, how he brought this issue up in his curriculum during class, and also, in fact, his own personal life and his choice to have a child with his wife. And so it shows how this issue deals with how we live this out and deal with it personally, as well as how we teach other people. And how those two things intersect or how we look at them differently. And it's important because it highlights, make an ethical appeal. Part of what makes an ethical point strong is trying to show like how it applies to you directly and to others. It seems like you're playing favorites or imbalanced. It's hard to get people to take the ethical point seriously. And that's one reason why I think Lenin looks at writer's choice and how he tried to reconcile how he taught others about this and also how he dealt with it himself to avoid appearing hypocritical. And one thing that writer brings up here in paragraph 5 is the whole issue partly of how can people continue having children in developed nations to produce more pollution, especially if less developed nations will suffer most of the consequences. And it's one reason why he argues ethically it matters on a wide scale. And also a question that can not having children protect them from the dangers and problems caused by climate change in the first place. Then it goes further than this on page 515, second column, where outside data that the article points out argues that the track for temperature rising unless change happens. So it ties more into logical appeals of showing how this is a progressively worse issue of climate change increasing and why this can't just be ignored or things just go away on its own. And the essay goes in on page 516. Talks about a study with women in 2 different climate groups, how they try and balance both desires for family with fears of climate. So it shows other people are dealing with this issue as well. It's important because if the issue just seems like it's writer's concern and not really about a lot of the people, it don't seem as much high stakes. Where it shows other people are considering the same issues as they plan on having families or think about families for the future, that it raises why this issue matters. Other people, not just writer himself and his wife, are dealing with this. And it goes on page 517. One of the key points this brings up is top page 517. Second paragraph says, for an American, the total metric tons of carbon dioxide saved by all those measures over an entire lifetime of 80 years, it's 488. By contrast, metric tons saved when a person chooses to have one fewer child, 9,441. So this really kind of highlights one thing that Travis Ryder points out is that if people spend their entire life, taking this example of trying to actively reduce carbon footprint, how much less metric tons they would then prevent going in the atmosphere compared to if they have one less child. So it really kind of hits home and ties the logical and ethical appeals together, how much one extra person, even in one family, makes a difference to the larger scale of the environment. And multiply that by multiple families really kind of adds up to how many thousands or millions eventually metric tons of carbon dioxide difference this makes, depending on how many children people have. This is a really, I think, strong point in the essay where it ties together the ethical and logical appeals in a very direct and clear way by comparing those stats. And it goes to the next paragraph, 54 and 55. And a student asks, what happens if that kid you decide not to have would have been this person who grew up and essentially cured this? Again, great question, says Ryder. The answer is still no. First, the chances are slim. More to the point, he says, valuing children as a means to an end, be it to cure climate change or, say, provide soldiers for the state, is ethically problematic. So it kind of shows him dealing with the counter-argument as well, that we can't just gamble that one of these children potentially born would help solve this because there's no way to know that for sure. It's too much of a long shot, too uncertain. So it kind of shows how Ryder really thought this through and dealing with the kind of issues coming up in this that his students raised. He's not trying to argue there's one simple answer, but how complicated it is. And he goes into page 518. This starts to go towards the proposed solution that he looks at. He talks about the possibility that in poorer countries, help fund birth control measures, and also possibly consider rich countries a child tax that would incentivize people to have less children. So it really kind of shows he tries to model a solution based on the different needs of a country. In ones that are less developed countries where populations tend to be higher due to lack of education, resources, or knowledge on birth control, he argues trying to increase public awareness can give people more choice in how many children they have, which then automatically tie back to the earlier point on less children means less carbon dioxide tonnage being put in the atmosphere. In richer countries, financial incentives, he argues, is a effective measure. And he points this out because he wants to avoid some other past population restrictive policies like those used in China for the one-child rule to avoid any kind of gray or dangerous areas of state control and people's family planning. That's one reason why he gives these two solutions is more ethical. And ultimately, he still points out this is still gives people the choice, that ultimately these are encouragements and education directions, not direct orders or laws to force people to choose how many children they have. And that's how I think Ryder avoids some of the more direct, ethical, personal freedoms being violated that more severe restrictions would then bring up if you propose those. All right, then the last essay, Bernard Loki, is 4 Reasons Climate Change Affects National Security. This one looks more at issues then of military and social security, or not social security, but social stability connected to climate change. Thesis goes into is in paragraph 4. It says, quote, I know there are still some folks back in Washington who refuse to admit that climate change is real. This is quoting from President Obama at a speech several years ago. The president told graduating cadets, as him speaking at a National Coast Guard graduation. Denying it or refusing to deal with it endangers our national security. It undermines the readiness of our forces. Here are Obama's 4 main arguments connecting climate change to national security in the new report. So it shows how Loki tries to tie this speech, these cadets in the Coast Guard, who he targets as one group particularly by their job dealing with coastal issues, will deal with climate change hands-on, and also ties a larger report produced by the Obama administration about issues at the time, and security issues tied to climate change. One thing it goes into is number 1, infrastructure and military bases are at risk of sea rise, that because various infrastructure projects, cities, bridges, dams, etc., will be impacted by water, as well as military bases, which many of them are near water sources or coastal areas, will directly face climate issues. This really kind of highlights one example of what the report points out, that this would affect directly military stability in some areas or usability of these infrastructure sources or these bases. And it goes into section 2, argues that Arctic-based ocean food sources supplies would also move due to water temperature. This also ties back to the idea of rising acidity of oceans. As oceans get hotter, more acidic, food supplies change, and so animals that feed on those prey would have to move or look further and further for food sources. This would then change food supply access both for animals and for people, and that would then also change the food supply. And this goes to the larger security point of food supply can tie then as sources become more scarce, people will be more willing to fight or desperate to get them. And that ties again back to security issues the essay is about. Section 3 goes into issues of infrastructure further. Highlights on page 520 that electrical system access will diminish or be stopped. So it highlights then as infrastructure sources will be more damaged or more pressured by constant use or by disruption from storms and natural disasters. Again, highlighting that this will make it harder for people then to live their daily lives and also for stability and access to resources. Section 4 goes into various examples of military facilities impacted by severe weather. This idea that these various bases will then be impacted again, affecting the military readiness to use those bases for military engagements. Goes in paragraph 15, cites Pentagon assessment, says the president has made the argument before. No challenge, he said in the State of the Union address in January, poses a greater threat to future generations than climate change, adding that Pentagon says that climate change poses immediate risks to national security. We should act like it. This really kind of highlights that in this speech, references other sources, the Pentagon itself and other military advisors recognize that this has been a severe issue to military stability and readiness. And the essay ends with a quote that stresses, going back to the speech of the Coast Guard, climate change will impact military goals and service. So this really highlights and gives a kind of area of climate change, like some of the others in this chapter, people have really thought of, is how this affects our military stability and in terms also our military security for the U.S. All right, then the next essay All right, last one of the chapter is by Daniel Liverman and Amy Glassmer. What are the economic consequences of climate change? This one focuses on the first paragraph, highlights how money and physical toll of huge storms would have, where it discusses in the first paragraph that when Hurricane Sandy pummeled the East Coast in the U.S. and Caribbean in October 2012, it exposed millions of people and billions of dollars worth of economic assets to the sorts of hazards that might be expected to increase as a result of climate change. An estimated 1.8 million structures and homes were destroyed or damaged, and economic losses exceeding $65 billion. So his essay, Liverman and Glassmer Strategy, is pretty effective in terms of trying to take this larger global issue and kind of filter it through key examples. And this is a good strategy to use because it helps you then make this more accessible. You take a well-known disaster that people were familiar with, like Hurricane Sandy, that's in recent history show this is still a current issue since this happened less than 10 years ago, and also highlights using logical appeals just how wide-ranging economic and structural damage, apart from all the emotional, psychological, and physical toll on people's lives and death toll that's caused by this massive storm system. It really kind of demonstrates the larger idea that as climate change worsens, as the storms worsen, these kind of things will become more common, not less so. The thesis of their essay goes into this paragraph 5, argues that events like these show how climate change will result in more severe storms, will have huge and very global impact, economic impact, and the impacts will hit locally and ripple out by affecting supply chain, consumer behaviors, regional economies, and downstream jobs. So it's really kind of an all-inclusive thesis. It's really well worded because it cites the various areas of the economy. They're going to itemize and look through one at a time. So it really kind of shows how well thought out Liverman and Glassmer have made this argument. They're going to go into this one piece at a time and then build their case gradually to try and show why this has such an impact and so meaningful. And it goes into page 522. Top right-hand column argues how there's a little funding in terms of how the economy is impacted by climate change. This really highlights then why this issue has to be addressed, and not enough government preparations or organizations are putting money or resources into preparing and understanding how this would impact climate change. And because of that, it means these systems are less prepared for when these things happen. It goes further in paragraph 15, bottom page 522, argues that the 2011 Thai flood drove up computer costs due to flooding of factories for computer parts in the areas of Asia that were hit by the flooding. So this is also a good example how they use specific details in particular cases to show the larger global impacts, in this case affecting supply chains that extend far beyond the countries that are directly hit by these storms. Then it goes into page 523, paragraph 19. Scientists should draw from business studies for data. So it shows how this goes towards the proposed solution, that researchers, scientists, leaders should look towards cross-referencing data. We can see that how. So the article ends with a strategy of by cross-referencing data from business institutions that run projections on how disasters and employees' productivity is impacted by these storms. If scientists gather their data and they work together, they can work with the government to get a more realistic sense of how to deal with, prepare for the economic impacts that these storms have, that put people out of jobs, displace them from their homes, destroy their businesses, which then affects the larger economy, both regionally and largely as a whole as well, as it spreads out through ripple effects throughout the United States and other countries as well that deal with similar disasters. It's really going to highlight how this has been a ignored or area of this issue that hasn't been addressed, which should be addressed seriously. And also the essay, I think, does a good job of really highlighting how this impacts quality of life and people's ability to then care for themselves and contribute to their community, rather than trying to look at the economy strictly in a very cold or heartless way. It looks at it in a way that's very meaningful and considerate of the cost economic harm does to people across the economy. All right, that concludes this essay. I think overall this chapter, I think, does a great job of showing a wide range of articles dealing with how climate change impacts people's lives and overall the quality of life people have. And by having this wide range of sources, it really highlights why this issue has to be addressed. I think one thing this tries to get articles could have done is maybe go through more proposed solutions that people can do just on the ground in their daily lives. because this is where they have the most impact directly, is how they live every day. Some of the articles go through this, but that could be one area they can go through further, and then they can also possibly tie to how we vote for our leaders as well. That would tie to how that changes how leadership deals with or addresses social pressures and public pressure to address this issue more effectively going forward. All right, let me know your thoughts in emails if you have any questions, or if you want to discuss this further with your classmates, feel free. Otherwise, hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you on our next series of videos, which will start dealing with our novel Black House. So if you don't have that book already, please get it soon, so that way you can begin reading it, and give yourself plenty of time in case you need more time to read the book. Because remember that it will be the preparation for our final for the class. All right, thank you. Have a good night.